Hey everyone, and welcome back to Roundup Save. If you're new to Roundup Save, my name is Neil, and I run the channel with my fiancée Jenna. Roundup Save is all about demystifying money, and that covers a big range of topics. So in my video on the psychology of money by Morgan Housel, I mentioned that I'd be doing a follow-up because there are so many good nuggets of information. There's one chapter in the book in particular towards the end that I found really insightful, and it's all about the history of American consumerism. It's no secret that US consumers spend a ton of money, and as a country, we're just all not that good at saving. In our Saving Survival Guide video, we talked about how the US ranks #1 from a GDP perspective, but doesn't even crack the top 10 in terms of percent of personal savings per capita. So to me, it really begs the question why, and I thought this chapter really highlighted the topic super well, and so today we're gonna go through it. The author takes us back over a century to try and get some insight. To make the video a little bit easier to follow, I've broken out the timeline into several events that I've linked in the timestamps down below, so feel free to just jump around and use that as an outline. All right, so it pretty much starts at the end of World War II. The war ends in 1945, and as we all know, the Allies won. But there were some looming questions back home in the United States about what was gonna happen next. Basically, during the war, 16 million Americans had gone out to fight, and that was about 11% of the country at the time. The average age of US soldiers abroad was 23 at the time, and a big cohort of soldiers were gonna come back home. But the US economy had really been geared towards helping the war efforts. For example, housing construction basically halted during the war, and the majority of the private sector had been converted to aiding in the development of airplanes, military weapons, things of that nature. Now, given the war was over, none of that was really needed as much. And so production specializations and industries needed to rebound and fast. On top of that, all these young vets coming back home, well, they wanted to get married and they wanted to start their lives pretty quickly soon after that. So the biggest questions facing the country at the time were, what were these vets gonna do when they came back home, and where the heck were they gonna live? Economists were basically freaked out at the time that not being able to answer these questions might lead the country back into a depression. And so the Fed, and it should be noted that the Fed actually was not politically independent at the time, so the Fed, in conjunction with the White House, decides to lower interest rates to a very low 0.38%. And the rates did not change for about 7 years. This made borrowing incredibly easy for the vets coming back home. And so all of a sudden they were able to afford houses, cars, televisions, washing machines, everything that, they needed to start living their lives. And the funny thing is that even monthly mortgage payments in some cases were lower than what rentals were. So it just goes to show how cheap it was to borrow money at the time. And so with all this borrowing going on, of course, debt started to increase, and household debt essentially 10x'd in a 20-year period from 1945 to 1965. And on top of that, credit cards were introduced in 1950. So that even enabled consumer credit to skyrocket even further. Not to mention, all interest on debt, including credit cards, was tax deductible at the time. Insane, right? So if you look at everything just from this angle, it looks like debt was going to go skyrocket and it was going to create a big issue. But at the same time, there was a productivity and innovation boom that was starting to really hit its stride. And this boom can be attributed back to the fact that Americans had to become very resourceful during the Great Depression of the 1930s. So this demand plus innovation started to create a lot of jobs. And as you can imagine, now there was finally the answer to the question of what these vets were going to do. To quote from the book, they were going to buy stuff with money earned from their jobs making new stuff, helped by cheap borrowed money to buy even more stuff. Okay, so the country's really in a good place economically, and it's largely a function of the poorer becoming richer. This was a time in American history where we went through a period of economic equality. Yes, I said economic equality. All of a sudden, the life of a uber rich person and somebody in the middle class started to look kind of the same. For example, people owned cars, everybody owned a home, everybody had a refrigerator and a television set. The standard of living was no longer hugely different if you were in the top 1% compared to if you were in the 50%. And here's a pretty cool stat. Income for the bottom 20% of wage earners grew by the same amount as the top 5% between 1950 and 1980. So even though lifestyles are being flattened because of the fact that Americans can borrow pretty easily and cheaply, debt is growing, but at the same time, incomes are also growing. So the debt to income ratio is relatively okay and balanced. There was a sort of general cultural acceptance all of a sudden where debt is okay to take on and it's not super scary. So, for parents and children who had lived during the Depression, now all of a sudden having a home was like winning the game. Home ownership at the time was the symbol of the American dream. But of course, not everything was going to stay the same forever. Fast forward to 1973 and recession hits. On top of that, inflation is surging and debt is all of a sudden becoming an issue. Also, as we all know what took place in the 70s, America was fighting another war abroad, that time in Vietnam, and there was the civil rights movement in full swing. Other economies were really starting to do well too. Like Japan was booming and China was opening up its economy to foreign investment, and the Middle East, of course, was starting to flex their oil muscles. However, cultural expectations were lagging behind the reality at the time. Basically, spending continues, and that wealth distribution that we talked about a little earlier, that's no longer happening. The top earners are earning way more compared to the bottom, and that's kind of carried out all to today. Between 1993 to 2012, the top 1% saw incomes grow by almost 90%. But the bottom 99 saw just 7% growth. And so once again, history, of course, is repeating itself, and we are finding an uber rich class. And this wealth redistribution translates to a smaller group of Americans being able to differentiate their lifestyles completely from the rest. But the country had just gone through a period of economic equality, and people weren't happy about that anymore. Lifestyles were no longer looking the same, and this made people jealous. Everyone wants it, but not everyone can afford it. Household debt to income stayed flat from 1963 to 1973. Then it climbed and climbed and climbed from around 60% in 1973 to more than 130% by 2007. Economic inequality continued. And to quote again from the book, this shift was symptomatic of the bigger thing that's happened since the early 1980s. The economy works better for some people than others. Success isn't as meritocratic as it used to be, and when success is granted, it's rewarded with higher gains than in previous eras. And so with this difference in lifestyles, plus social media, Facebook and Instagram, just to name a few, we all know what happens with that. It just amplifies, and all of a sudden, you even have more jealousy. And so it's no wonder that we spend like mad, even though we can't afford it. So the biggest takeaway for me from this chapter was the fact that attitudes lag behind reality. And it really speaks to the need for society at large to recognize that. It's important that we play a longer-term game and embrace reality. Probably the most important insight that I took away is that savings without a reason is actually really good, because no one knows what the future actually holds. Guys, that's basically it. I hope you found this video to be a fun one and also insightful. So what do you think about all this? What do you find to be interesting from the history of American consumerism? Are there things that I missed in the video? Are there other points that you think are worthwhile to call out? Go ahead, leave a comment down below and let's get a conversation started, because I'd be really curious to know. If you found this video to be helpful and you liked it, please go ahead and hit that like button, and also consider subscribing to the channel for more content just like this. All right guys, have a great day, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.